Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this important conversation today. My name is Kim Hart. I'm the Director of Policy and Programs here at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and we're pleased to co-host today's event with the African Studies program. This event is part of our Meet the Moment series, where we look at today's critical peace and security issues from the lens of women's engagement and women's leadership. Today, we'll be discussing escalating violence and volatility in South Sudan and the risks of large-scale conflict and mass atrocities, as well as the situation for women and girls. GWEP's recent report on conflicts to watch in 2026 highlighted South Sudan as one of the top 10 conflicts to watch this year from a women, peace, and security lens, due to significant concerns. And the country is ranked number 173 out of 181 countries in our WPS index. Today, it's a privilege to have this conversation with three leading experts on South Sudan. First, we'll hear from Nyagoa Pur, the South Sudan researcher from Human Rights Watch. Nyagoa has authored numerous pieces on the situation in South Sudan, most recently highlighting the risk of mass atrocities in the country amidst renewed civil war. We will also hear today from Adu Christina Salva, Executive Director of the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network. Founded in 2005, the organization's focus is on the empowerment of women through programs that encourage women's participation in decision-making, gender, and human rights advocacy. Finally, we're joined by Jacqueline Nasiwa, founder and executive director of the Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace, and Justice, a South Sudanese women's rights organization working to further gender inclusion, peace building, transitional justice, and good governance in the country. After the panel, we'll be taking questions from the audience, and some of you have already submitted questions online. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat as you submit questions, and that way our colleagues can catch them in real time and make sure that we get to them during the question and answers. So let me welcome my panelists to turn on their cameras where possible, and if not, we know there's some connection issues, and then we can get started. Perfect. Yagoa, I'm going to turn to you first. You put out this incredible statement recently that was really a call to action about the situation in South Sudan. So I wonder if you can provide an overview of the current context and where conflict is escalating and why. What are the greatest risks that you see in the months ahead, including the risks of mass atrocities?
Thanks very much, Kim, for having me and for organizing this very important forum. It's such a pleasure to be here. The situation in South Sudan has, I'm sad to say, has been long in the making. Because since a peace agreement, was signed in 2018, the peace agreement of 2018 did not really arrest the situation or stop the abuses, although although they were not to a large scale as before. But conflict did continue in several parts of the country, especially where both government forces and SPLA-IO groups like the National Salvation Front that have been outside the peace process were operating in parts of central Equatoria. We saw violations between 2018 and 2025 in several parts of the country. But the most recent escalation that we're seeing in the country raises very serious alarm bells. Because since early 2025, we saw conflicts breaking out in part of the country called Nasser. And for the first time, we were seeing the government conducting aerial bombardments in populated areas. And those aerial bombardments had dire impacts on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including, killings, older people. We documented in March 2025 the use of incendiary weapons in three counties, Nasser, Longachuk, in Nasser, and in three counties of Upper Nile. And this also led to, killings, people being immolated. What was very concerning is not just the fact that these were being conducted in civilian areas, but also even the timing of these attacks. They were being conducted at night when people were asleep in their own homes, quite egregious and quite brutal. And so we've seen violations for most of 2025, starting with conflicts in Upper Nile in Nasser, and then the spread of the conflict to parts of Western Barghazal and Western Equatoria, where the government was starting to dismantle checkpoints, where the opposition were using these checkpoints and market and trade routes to get money or to obtain resources because opposition fighters don't get paid, even when there is a process in the peace deal that is supposed to unify forces from all sides. So there has been opportunism and predatory tactics from both sides, with civilians at the center of these. Now, everything, escalated even more when the government conducted arrests of key opposition leaders, including the first vice president, Riek Machar. In September, a trial opposition actors and the first vice president, who was suspended, were then charged with crimes including treason. And so all these events, the violations conducted in Nasser, the killing of government forces by White Army, a Nuer militia that has historically been affiliated with the SPLA-IO, and the IO themselves committed abuses in parts of government areas in Upper Nile. And so a combination of all these factors really brought the peace, really started tearing the peace agreements apart. We also started seeing deliberate efforts by, President Kiir's party to dismantle parts of the peace agreement. And all this continued to raise tensions. The SPLA-IO split, and a split in the factions also created more command control gaps and more turmoil on the ground, with now the IO starting with government bombardments starting again, towards the end of December. President Kiir making administrative changes, taking away power from the SPLA-IO that was given to them by the peace agreement. Then all this then led to a counteroffensive or a counterinsurgency being started by the SPLA-IO in parts of northern Jonglei. Now, what we have seen since December 2025 is one of the largest military offensives that we have seen in the country since the peace agreement was signed. The IO strategically attacked key government military positions, taking bases and engaging in guerrilla tactics, also attacking, civilian villages in government-controlled territories, with reports of abuses being committed. In response, the government conducted aerial bombardments in the three counties in areas that are held by the opposition in northern Jonglei, and also imposed a no-fly zone, meaning that humanitarian actors could not get into the country, could not get into those areas to deliver life-saving aid. So the combination of all these factors has created a very dire humanitarian crisis, with over 250,000 people displaced in northern Jonglei alone, creating a health and humanitarian emergency. Now, I was told today that it looks like the government may have withdrawn or may have given humanitarian actors orders that allow, may have given them the directives to resume humanitarian aid in these areas, which is a result of the sustained pressure, and public calls that we have seen from diplomats, the African Union, and many others, and many other groups, and even civil society, calling for the government to ensure humanitarian access and to also end abuses against civilians in this area. But the risk of mass atrocities is far from over, because in as much as the conflict is not making international news or even local news because of the kind of lack of access that local journalists have, or the lack of civic and political space to be able to talk about such key critical issues in the country, the conflict is continuing, and we continue to get reports of violations being committed. We're hearing reports of, abductions, of, sexual violence, of looting and pillaging and burning of civilian homes and unlawful killings, including executions. And so, in as much as it's not on the news every day, um, largely also because the government has shut down communication networks in this region. So it's very difficult for information to be corroborated and for information to come out about what is taking place. And so this paints the picture of what we are very concerned about, in that it is very possible that mass atrocities will be taking place if the situation is not controlled, if all sides are not, are do not stop, attacking or targeting civilians and civilian objects.
Thank you so much for that extremely sobering analysis of just how challenging the context is. I wonder if you could say a little bit more, particularly about the situation for women and girls in South Sudan today in these conflict-affected areas or at-risk areas. What are you seeing in terms of their security, and the needs that they have in particular?
So, in as much as the focus is on Northern Jonglei, the consistent patterns that we have seen over the last few months, whether in Western Equatoria, whether in other parts of the country where conflict has been taking place, we have seen abductions, and sexual violence being committed against women and girls. We have also documented how the government, as part of a strategy to arrest crime by gangs in Juba, conducted arbitrary arrest, detentions, and other abuses. Amongst these abuses were of girls who were arrested and detained in police sites, who were also who were raped and gang raped by police officers. Um, And as part of this government's campaign also included forced recruitment. And so young boys, largely young boys and young men being taken to conflict zones to fight. But also the UN has put out reporting, since last year, with the escalation since 2025, talking about how abductions and sexual violence are at an all-time high, especially in central Equatoria and parts of western Equatoria as well. But other than conflict-related abuses, we know that there are gender dynamics when it comes to conflict in itself. We're hearing reports in places like Southern Unity, where women and girls who go looking for firewood or who go to the markets for long stretches of time are being attacked by criminal actors along the roads, right? And because of the nature of this predation or the opportunism around it, we're not seeing a lot of government action taking place to stop these kinds of abuses. But the impact on the no-fly zones and the lack of medical assistance, all this also affects survivors of sexual violence, ensuring that they're getting the support that they need, both in terms of medical as well as mental health and psychosocial support and other care and support that they need. It's not getting to them because of humanitarian aid restrictions. Also, because in general, the most humanitarian aid groups have been facing funding cuts since 2025. And so we find that lots of programs that used to respond to protection, to health, have been cut and have been affected. In parts of Western Equatoria, a place like Nagero, where we've been doing research, we heard how difficult it was for doctors to support women who were giving birth after they fled. Doctors and civilians alike, fled their homes, and doctors often fled without their tools, without any equipment, without any drugs, right? And it was very difficult to respond to the needs of, women who were giving birth. In these kinds of conditions. When we were doing research on the aerial bombardments in Nasser, we found that community members, including one man I spoke with, who talked about how his wife had a miscarriage because when the bombs fell, she set off running in the dark and she fell down into a hole. She was 6 months pregnant, and after a day, she had a miscarriage. And there were also other cases we heard from community members who talked about, three other women that, lost their babies within that time range, either because of the shock of the abuses that were taking place or just the condition under which they were fleeing and, the lack of humanitarian support into areas that they fled to. We're also hearing a lot of, uh, in um, in past cycles, we have documented in Southern Unity and elsewhere, we have documented the direct attacks on older people and people with disabilities, including older women and women with disabilities, because they're either because they're left behind and unable to flee, or because people leave them thinking that because of that because of their condition that they will be spared. Right. But we're finding, in Southern Unity, especially, I came across many cases of older women that were burnt in their homes or that were summarily executed by attacking forces. So there's a myriad of issues that women and girls in conflict zones in South Sudan are facing and are having to endure.
It's just absolutely devastating to hear the context and these individual stories really bring to life what women and girls are dealing with every day. Thank you for sharing that. Let me turn it to Adut Christina and ask you to share a little bit. Your organization works to advance women's rights. Do you have any additions to the context that Nyagoa shared about what's going on for women and girls in the country? And then I'd like to also ask you, how are women leaders and organizations like yours responding to the situation where you can with the resources that you have?
Hi, Kim. It appears her connection has
Oh,
been
shoot.
interrupted.
Okay, we'll come back to her, but I want to get her perspective on this too. Let me turn it to Jacqueline then. Jacqueline, maybe similar questions for you about what you're seeing in the context, what your organization is doing. I know you work extensively in Jonglei. And also, just given the work that you do, I'd be curious to hear a little bit, given all your work on transitional justice, where you see the connections between challenges around transitional justice and where we are today.
Thank you very much, Kim, and good evening and morning to all those who are from the other side of the world. Happy to be in this webinar today to share the linkages between transitional justice and the ongoing conflicts in the country. And I think Nyagwa has elaborated on the context and where we are today. I could say that the lack of implementation of the transitional justice has not helped us in ending impunity in the country. And the 2018 our access provide for Chapter 5, which is the transitional justice mechanisms. And in that mechanism, we have three main institutions to be established, which is the hybrid court for South Sudan for accountability purposes. And then we have the Commission for Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation, which is for healing and also for documentation of the violations that happen, and more focus on the experiences of women and girls and the vulnerable groups. Reparations is also one of them, which is the Compensation and Reparations Authority, in which communities are supposed to get compensated and start rebuilding their lives again. So all these processes had been slow, although recently we have witnessed the progress in terms of the establishment of the Commission for Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation, and also the legislation for both the Commission for Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation and the Compensation and Reparations Authority. So the law is one thing, but also the practical implementation and ensuring it's implemented is also one thing. So currently, the Ministry of Justice has concluded through the panel for recruitment the selection of the commissioners for the CTRH. And this is not conclusive because these names are to go to Parliament for vetting process. And those who are vetted will now go ahead to establish the CTRH. So from 2018 to date, we are still struggling with the implementation and operationalization of the transitional justice mechanisms. And one thing I will say is that transitional justice is very important for South Sudan in terms of providing healing for the people who are affected with decades of conflict, and particularly for women and girls who bear the brunt, not only being displaced, but also being sexually abused or exposed to more risks, including risks of displacement, risks of torture, and risk of, being vulnerable to other war crimes. So these kinds of women and children require some hope. And without transitional justice processes, and particularly accountability measures that deter future occurrences and abuses, women still continue to experience the violations and also experience the atrocities that are committed, just as Nyagwa has put it. So we
Jacqueline, I think you froze for us. Can you hear us? Uh-oh, thanks everybody for bearing with the tech issues today. Hopefully we can get Jacqueline back.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you now. It froze for like about 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. Sorry about it. So what I'm saying is that there's no sustainable peace that can come to South Sudan without justice mechanisms. And our experience from 2018 to date has shown that justice becomes the pillar for South Sudan. And one of the things I say is that currently there are trial processes which are going on in Juba, including the trial of Dr. Riek Machar, the first vice president. And those trials cover aspects of transitional justice, and those are war crimes and crimes against humanity. But this is selective justice to me. And I would like to see that women who have been abused, who have been subjected to these atrocities till to death, they get justice. And the justice should go to the civilians and not to those who are fighting each other. The other important element is that we are having the sexual violence victims. The Center for Inclusive Governance, Peace and Justice has supported survivors, and they have established the Survivors Network for South Sudan, which is one of the largest network and focusing more on conflict-related sexual violence. And these survivors would like to see that there's justice to them. They would like to see that there's recognition of the harm done to them. And they also want to see that transitional justice is implemented. And for them, transitional justice gives them hope. For example, they went and learned from Uganda. They visited some of the memorial sites in northern Uganda from the LRA atrocities. And they feel emotional, and they feel also they need to recognize those that are lost, but also they need to start that they have the dignity and that they are respected in the communities. There are a lot of children who are born out of rape, and some of them even don't have certificates of nationalities because their mothers are required to produce a father figure. And they have like their uncles or brothers or cousins stand for them as their parents. So legal reforms also become important in this aspect because these children are citizens and they deserve also their dignity to be recognized. And finally, in regards to the transitional justice processes, what I will say is that all through the country, the violations that happened way back, even from 2007 to date, there are no accountability mechanisms to try those perpetrators. And continuous violation shows that impunity probably is the norm, which shouldn't have been the norm, because if people are held accountable, at least people will uphold the rule of law. And we are talking about institutional reforms and legislative reforms, but without accountability and without respect to the rule of law, most of this will remain on paper as violations continue to grow. And I could say that most sites, as Nyagwa said, are responsible for atrocities in one way or another, and proper accountability mechanisms probably needs to be put in place. And we say that the African Union partially also has a big role to play in the establishment of the hybrid court and also in the establishment of peace in the continent. However, because of this slowness in the process from both those who are entrusted to establish this, we are seeing that the violence continue because people feel, so what if I will commit this? So it's high time that international community, the African Union takes it seriously, and the government also takes it seriously that they need to end the war. And recently, we just held a stakeholders dialogue and consultations where we call for no return to war and we call for dialogue. And I think dialogue will be the one to resolve all these issues. If you see the cost of the war and not only the human cost, but also the economic aspects that is spent on weapons, spent on logistics to coordinate fightings here and there, is way more than if we are to develop the country and move forward. So one of the things we advocate for is the nonviolent approach to peace, and that the little resources that is left for the country should be used for service delivery rather than for conflict in the country. Humanitarian access has become a challenge, and communities live without services. South Sudan is dependent on international humanitarian assistance. And if the conflict is going on, this humanitarian access could not be brought near to the people who are affected. And most of these are women and children. It's really saddening to see how people who are displaced are not even able to get a meal in a day to survive on, and let alone those who remain in the communities, how are they surviving? So this war is really not necessary. It's not important for either sides. And I could say that political dialogue could be the one to take people forward. But again, we need to see that sanity is put in place through accountability mechanisms. And the judiciary has a reform process which is supposed to take place, but these reforms are not taking place because of lack of funding to the judicial institution. So this also makes it difficult for the law enforcement agencies to start applying and also to ensure that justice prevails in the country.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for all those insights and also the calls to action to support rule of law and transitional justice, to increase humanitarian access and shift resources towards humanitarian access, to support political dialogue to resolve this conflict. Yagoa, maybe I'll turn to you with a similar question of what are your recommendations that you'd like to share with this audience for the international community, both about the broader context and about supporting women and girls in South Sudan?
Thanks again. I think first and foremost, there has to be sustained and concerted pressure from regional actors who are close to the situation. We have seen countries like Uganda playing a negative role in South Sudan's conflict. Last year, we saw Uganda providing technical support to government forces during the offensive in Nasser, Ulang, and Longachuk, involving aerial bombardments, including ground attacks. And so there has to be concerted effort to ensure that regional players do not participate to support either side in the conflict and the extension of abuses in the country. And that processes such as the UN arms embargo that was put in place in 2018 to prevent the flow of weapons into the country. We're seeing how the conflict in Sudan has also created a very porous border. It has created not only a humanitarian crisis for South Sudan, but also a lens to the political crisis in South Sudan. Not just because the conflict that we're seeing is not only a struggle for power and a competition for resources, but we're seeing how that competition then fuels atrocities as well. And so, in as much as the conflict in Sudan looks very far removed from the South Sudan conflicts, the continuation of the Sudan conflict has impacts not only on the humanitarian situation in South Sudan, but also the fact that armed groups from either side could be participating in the South Sudan conflict. And we have also seen, the UN reporting in the case in Sudan, how people of Southern descent are participating in the conflict in Sudan. And so sustained international pressure on, on the government primarily because right now they have the upper hand to ensure that civilians are not targeted, that rules of war are observed, international human rights is observed in all places where conflict is taking place. Accountability, the issue around impunity has been, like Jacqueline has outlined, has been a persistent factor since 2013. I was pleased to see recently the African Union, well, it's something that they've said time and time again, but there has been no follow through, that the hybrid court should urgently be established. So I don't know how urgent the AU timeline is. Is it as urgent as a month or is it as urgent as 5 years? But, victims, it was very clear in the last few weeks how the lack of accountability for past abuses, whether we're talking about the massacre of Dinka Boer people in 1991 by forces allied to Riek Machar, how that incident and its legacy continues to come up again and again and again. It came up in 2013, that lack of accountability around it. And, when the elite in Juba disagreed amongst themselves, 1991 was once again invoked as what happened in 1991 will not happen again. We also saw recently with the Jonglei offensive how the governments especially started stoking fear of the Dinka community as a way to mobilize young people from these regions to join the army and fight against the incoming rebel, the IO offensive, that Bor will not fall and 1991 will not happen again. So we're seeing time and time again how those historical, same thing, like even with the IO invoking the massacres of Nuer people in 2013, how invoking that sense of, that continued sense of victimhood and the continuing impact and legacy of that. So those wounds that are unhealed continue to perpetuate cycles of abuses, not just in Northern Jonglei, not just between the Dinka and the Nuer, but also majority parts in other parts of the country as well. We're seeing it even, amongst how political actors, continue to fuel the Azande and the Balanda against each other, ethnic groups that have lived together for decades and have intermarried, right? How often this often is used. So accountability is part and parcel. And it's important that the international community emphasizes on leaders from all sides to refrain from this kind of hostile rhetoric we have seen that is concerning. We saw a government general talking about how no one should be spared during the counteroffensive against the SPLM-IO. And while the information is still coming out about what is happening in Northern Jonglei, what the White Army and the SPLA-IO have done against civilians, but also what the government and its allied forces have done. Whether those statements about, targeting civilians will actually have been implemented, right? So I think, so far the preliminary information we're getting shows that civilians have been targeted and civilians are protected under international law. So it's a call for the international community to, one, facilitate humanitarian access ensure that the no-fly zone that was imposed in January 1 is completely lifted, and that humanitarian actors are able to do their job safely, including local humanitarian actors who are often more vulnerable to these attacks because they live within the communities that are often targeted. Another key call would be around the role of the UN mission in South Sudan. The mission is downsizing due to a global budgetary crisis that the UN is facing. But what we're seeing with now so far, several offices and bases have been shut down. We saw bases even in places where there is, the places that are at risk of atrocities. We're seeing the UN withdrawal. The presence of the UN peacekeeping forces in some of these areas is a deterrent, but also allows and enables early warning. There are many places that I have gone to in South Sudan where I have seen the positive impact of effective patrols being done by peacekeepers, but also even when the UN opens up its doors to fleeing civilians. So whether because of the budget cuts or because of the consistent and constant pressure of the government against the UN, what kind of mission is going to be left in South Sudan, and will it be effective in the protection of civilians at such a pivotal moment that there is ongoing violence and the potential of elections at the end of the year? Knowing that if elections are not well conducted, if the conditions including how are we going to expect civilians who are fleeing violence to be able to vote, right? Or is the plan for areas that are not experiencing violence to vote? How will we have elections if there's no space for civic and political rights? So it's important also the international community, and as much as I'm seeing lots of actors, many actors, diplomats and countries calling for elections at the end of the year, what are the conditions that will allow for a credible process to take place? And does the broader public, civil society, does the broader public have the freedom to freely participate in matters of public interest? And even now, we have seen threats being made by government officials against journalists about how they are reporting on the ongoing conflict and other issues of concern in the country. Basically saying, you have to toe a certain line. If you have to try to be the friend of the government, you know what will happen to you if you don't. And this is messaging that civil society and journalists have seen over and over again over the last decade, and has led to self-censorship.
Thank you so much to both of you for sharing those important recommendations and insights on what the international community should do and how it can be supportive, and also what it shouldn't do in this context. Adut Christina's connection, unfortunately, is not allowing her to reconnect to this call, so hopefully she can by the end. If not, we can invite her to share some thoughts by email and send them to participants, because we want to hear her important insights. But in the meantime, let me turn to my colleague Rebecca, who's going to share some of the questions that we received from the audience in advance. And then during this call, if you have questions that you'd like to pose to the participants, there's a Q&A function. You'll either see it right on the bottom of your screen, or if you click the 3 dots in the circle, it'll pop up on the side. And we'd love to see any of your questions that you have as well. So let me turn it over to you, Rebecca.
Okay, I'll offer 3 initial questions that sort of summarize a couple of the different questions we've received from the audience. The first is a bit more specifically about what are recommendations for the international community to support women and girls in this foreign aid crisis, especially women organizations that focus on supporting women and girls in hard to reach places in South Sudan. The other sort of questions we've received have been focusing on the political situation in South Sudan. So what are some practical steps that you and others are taking to draw attention to the current political situation? As well, do you think it will take a clean transition away from the current political party, or to bring South Sudan to a more peaceful future? And then another question that we've sort of received is about data and evidence coming from South Sudan. Is there any data and evidence lacking for women in South Sudan, and what needs to be researched more and spotlighted?
Thanks, Rebecca. Jacqueline, maybe I'll turn to you first to take any or all of those questions, as many as you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. I was also going through the questions, and I think there's a question in regards to the courts which were ongoing in terms of accountability mechanisms like the gender-based violence court. The gender-based violence court is in Juba, and it's looking at only cases of contemporary violations in the families, looking at issues of children in conflict with the law, and so forth. It's not covering conflict-related violations. So victims of sexual violence in conflict are not brought before this court. One of the challenge we have with the victims is that when these violations happen, they were either not given the Form 8 or there was no record of these cases. So because of that, you find that the Form 8 technically is not supposed to be part of the procedural technicality to deny justice, but it's being used to say like we need the Form 8 and we need the medical references and all this. So because of that, many survivors are not even able to access justice in this gender-based violence court or in any of the high courts in South Sudan across. So the military trials were going on, and we had the court martials in Yei, we had in Jonglei, we had in Bentiu, and also in Wau. So most of these military trials are also in Western Equatoria. They last for a period of 1 month. So you can imagine in 1 month collecting evidence of violations by armed groups and also looking for survivors who are probably even displaced from their communities becomes difficult. And as Nyagwa said, some of these incidences happen at night. So even these victims, they don't know who committed the crime. And then strict evidentiality procedures, if they are used, you need to name the perpetrator, you need to identify and all this, and this becomes difficult for victims. So how effective are these mobile courts? I could say they are important in highlighting the magnitude and probably the interest of the government in trying conflict-related sexual violence. But having observed the process, I feel that sexual violence victims are not even getting the justice they need. And sometimes also there's no appeal process to that, and the victims cannot be able to appeal because they're in the communities or because of also fear of reprisal or follow-up of these cases. Most of them who went to these courts, they never got reparations. And a few of them got reparations, say maybe like $100 or so. And you can imagine that for victims of sexual violence, it becomes very difficult for them. So these courts are good, but also they are not providing, I could say, just compensation or fair process for the victims. The mobile courts also, they are coming in terms of 1 month, and they are funded mostly by international partners. So they come once in a year probably, and then they don't cover the whole country, where we have seen like in Nasir, in Jonglei, and other parts. So what is important is how do we strengthen the local justice institutions at the local level to respond to gender-based violence escalation? And I think as the conflict is going on, we continue to receive new cases of conflict-related sexual violence or even increasing patterns of gender-based violence in the community, sometimes by armed youth, as Nyagwa said, or sometimes even by lawless men and boys in the community who commit this against women and children, going to as younger age as 8, and you can even for this time. And largely this is supported through the one-stop centers, and now with the shrinking funding gaps in South Sudan, they actually don't receive support a lot in the community. So they depend on civil society and INGOs who support them with the emergency support and also with the referral pathways and maybe recovery in terms of income generating activity. And this is only a piecemeal. It's not covering the larger communities of sexual violence in conflict. There's a question around sanctions, how it can be effective and whether it's effective or not. I could say that, sanctions, they are good deterrent, but implementation of these sanctions become a problematic, and especially in the region. So you find people move freely like there is no sanction on them. You also see them doing transactions. The geopolitical interests are also affecting the implementation of sanctions and also including the arms embargo and the rest. So this makes it difficult to think about peace in South Sudan and who are the allies who can really think positive to bring peace to South Sudan. And this is really affecting long-term sustainability. I can say that from 2000 maybe and 13, we are not building peace, but we are managing conflict or mitigating risks, but we have not sustained peace. So sustainability of peace is very important for South Sudan rather than managing conflicts. And I think Nyagwa gave the example like you come and attack us, we attack you, we chase you, you chase us. So this is more of a Tom and Jerry kind of a play, but it's not ending. And I think this is the situation in South Sudan. So this has left people to become more hopeless because they don't know when they can really rest. And one of the things I keep saying is that internal reflections of South Sudanese is very important. Like, what do we want from South Sudan? And I think in our dialogue that we had in late November, one of it is like envisioning the South Sudan we want. And there were good recommendations that came that we also shared with the policymakers and with the politicians and stakeholders on what we really want to envision South Sudan to look like. And some of those recommendations are long-term, others are practical, immediate. And I think the immediate one, as I said, is the return to dialogue, whether it's through the peace agreement that is very fragile now, or it is through regional bilateral discussions. Dialogue should be put on the radar. And if the conflict continue, I think even our soldiers, they are frustrated, no salaries. Even those who are in the rebel, they are tired of being in the bushes. They don't come to themselves, they come to the civilians. So that means that civilians will continue to carry the brunt. And with a lot of hate and incitement, I can say that our young generation is lost because they are growing up knowing violence. They are growing up knowing like, you have the gun, you are stronger. So this does not help our generation in terms of future development of the country. So in most of the conversation I have with youth is like, when you are told to go and fight, and if they give you money, just go and make a party, because there's no reason for you to pick it up and go and fight. But you can enjoy a party with your friends, with your communities, with your neighbors. So civil society currently, they are facing a challenge of the outreach. And with the donors pulling out, there is no opportunity for them to continue to dialogue with the communities and also to campaign for peace. And I think what is critical now is the campaign for peace in South Sudan. And I happen to be in Liberia and also in the Gambia. One of the things is the young people taking it up on themselves and saying no more. So that means we also need to have the grassroots movement for peace and supporting women and youth to be able to take this forward, and civil society is very critical. And the dialogues have proven to be very positive, and bringing political parties, bringing civil society representative, traditional leaders to discuss issues of the country is not only helping them to find solutions, but it's also helping them to heal. And at individual level, people have grown up with the trauma, re-traumatized, re-stigmatized, and they become very emotional. So such platforms for dialogue help them to heal and to start thinking positively about affairs of the country. And finally, I could say that we have laws which are also being pursued as part of the reforms, like the anti-gender-based violence bill, We are also having the affirmative action bill. All these are bills that relate to women's participation in peace and political processes. And currently, they are still not brought before the parliament. So probably more push, not only from civil society actors, but also from good friends of South Sudan to support these bills to move forward. And so that women can also have at least a reference to what is protecting them will become important.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for all that information.
Thank you.
Go over to you. And I see some additional questions. I know Rebecca's first question was about the funding environment. There's some additional questions about what that looks like vis-a-vis healthcare, gender-based violence, humanitarian aid too. So I know it's a lot of questions to throw at you, but adding another lens.
Hello?
Yeah, go over to you if you have thoughts on some of the questions that Rebecca originally posed as well.
Well, I wish there was a government representative on this panel as well, because some of these questions around what are the contingency plans, especially with the humanitarian drawdown in South Sudan, it'd be interesting to hear what what the government intends to do, because we have seen year in, year out when it comes to the annual budget allocations, service provision, including the health sector, the education sector, often receive a very minimal percentage of the national budget, well beyond the internationally recommended 7% standards of the Abuja Declaration. And so I'm not sure what the contingency planning is, but in the course of, doing research amongst conflict-affected communities, I've spoken to doctors and medical workers who have talked about drug and medical shortages. One person in Western Equatoria talked about how, because of the conflict and the displacement and populations fleeing for months on end, lots of people living with HIV or his patients that were living with HIV were not able to get their drugs, enough drugs to sustain them for the time that they had fled. And even upon return to their homes, the healthcare centers had been looted, and the government, they had gone 7 months without any support to the primary healthcare facilities in that area. But, I often I'm in awe often of doctors and civil servants in South Sudan who continue to work under very difficult conditions, even without pay, and making sacrifices. This particular man went to traveled to a different town or a city to get medication for his patients. Out of his own pockets. He didn't have to do that, but because of a dedication to the people that he takes care of or he serves. And so there is need to show up support for the situation in South Sudan. And I think in terms of the scale of the impact of the humanitarian drawdown of the budget cuts to the humanitarian sector in South Sudan and to the medical and to the health systems, that is yet to be fully grappled with or fully researched or to see the full scale of it. But last year with the displacement in Nasser, we saw cholera cases, going up, and we have continued to see this in places like Renk and elsewhere. So I think that's the answer I can offer now, that there's more need for support, especially to, protection, to responding to sexual and gender-based violence, to nutrition as well, and other key health issues that have a dire impact on women and girls. Regarding how South Sudan gets out of this, I think time and time again, there has been a large focus on individuals and personalities, but very little around institution shaping, ensuring that South Sudan has effective, independent institutions that can ensure checks and balances on the executive or on the people in power. The unfortunate structure of the peace agreement in South Sudan is that it has created a bloated government that is, and because also the Constitution created a super presidency, and because of practice as well, no one is able to hold the executive to account for their own actions. The judiciary doesn't do that. Parliament does not do that because the current parliament that's in place is made up of individuals that have been selected from various political parties. We saw it with in 2024, a bill that would transform the National Security Service, which is an agency that has been used as a tool of repression in the country to target political dissidents, civil society, and independent voices. So a law was presented in Parliament to change the behavior of this organization, including their power to arrest to arrest and detain without a warrant, their power to, the carte blanche surveillance of communications that they're able to do, amongst others. And while the bill went through a first and second round of reading, where there was robust debate about the need to change and bring this agency in line to the Constitution, we saw that in the final reading, all the parliamentary established processes around passing of a law were all thrown out the window. And whatever was proposed at the final stage of that reading was a bill that once again gave the National Security Service power, the power that was supposed to have been removed. And because of a parliamentary majority and the fact that even the National Security Service was in gallery, was actively present in a big way during that final reading. Many members of parliament, especially from the SPLM, voted in favor of this law. And so we once again have an agency that is so powerful. So checks and balances, independent institutions are important because strong institutions outlive individuals and personalities. And I think there are reform processes that were supposed to take place under the peace agreement, but unfortunately these processes have been selectively implemented, and some of them have not even taken place at all. And so the building and shaping of effective and independent institutions is important. The peace agreement in itself has created this cycle of rewarding perpetrators, right? The peace making industry in South Sudan is based off the very nature of peace processes, it seems, is based off rewarding violators, perpetrators, former belligerents. And this has created a continuous cycles of impunity, especially because the people that have and continue to commit abuses continue to enjoy power, and then continue to hold the tools that are supposed to also hold them to account. So we are in a difficult situation in South Sudan, where in order for accountability to take place, there has to be political will from the highest levels. And the highest levels are then responsible for the perpetuation of abuses. So that's why there's need for an independent process outside that can, intervene without fear or favor.
Thank you so much for those insights. And I'm so sorry to say that we are at time, even though we have so many incredible questions in the Q&A and the chat. We will be sharing a recording of this with participants and a little event recap, and hopefully we can get to some of the information that was shared today as well that gets to some of the questions that you all posed. I want to say a huge, huge thank you to our incredible panelists, both for their time today and also just their steadfast work to promote human rights, women's equality, transitional justice. The incredible work they're doing is just an inspiration to all of us, and especially at this important moment. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to join this conversation. And with that, we'll close the event. Thank you so much.